In this video, we will look at how can we test our assumption 2. The standard deviation of the residual is the same regardless of the given value of x. In the previous video I mentioned, so in the simple linear regression model, we will draw the residual against the x value as our scatter plot to examine the assumption 2. However, in the multiple regression model, we have multiple x. So what we will do is we will use the residual against our predicted y value to create the scatter plot to examine the assumption 2. So before we go to the Excel, let's see under what condition we will see the assumption 2 is not violated. So assumption 2 is not violated. Your scatter plot residual against the predicted y value should like this plot. So what are the characteristics for this plot? So if you look carefully for this plot, first you will see this horizontal line here is a 0. And what you will find is the amount of the scatter should be approximately the same for the predicted y value. So this is the horizontal axis is our predicted y value is alcohol amount, and the horizontal axis is residual. You can find as our predicted y value changes, and we cannot see any pattern for residuals. So the question is, can I give you some example about the assumption violated cases? Yeah, the answer is yes. So please look at this plot. So we have two plots here. So all of them indicate that assumption 2 is violated. So how so? So if you look at the first plot, so what you can find is I need to mention the horizontal axis is our predicted y value. So that is CD. So you can find when the CD is below 20s, we have more residuals above the 0 horizontal line, and when the CD is between 20 to 30, so we have more residuals below is a negative value, and after the 30 CD equal to 30, and we find like 4 more residual above 0. So obviously, as the predicted y value change, the residual showing up certain pattern. So we can conclude that the residual do have some relationship with our x variable. So how about the second one? So for the second one, the pattern is more obvious. So the predicted value is measured by the weight, and the vertical axis is the residual. And about before this point, so about 90s, about 93, the weight is 93, and we found the residual is negative. And once the predicted weight is above 93, all the residual are positive. So obviously the residual has a relationship with our predicted y values. So now, since we know under what condition we can recognize the assumption 2 is not violated, and what one situation we will think the assumption 2 is violated. Now we need to learn how can we use Excel to create this plot. So let's still using the GPA, age, and class standing example. What will affect the GPA? And we are arguing that maybe the age and the class standing will affect the GPA. So after we ran the regression model, and I already asked you to check 5 boxes on the regression dialog, and you should have this part of the output called the residual output. So if you pay attention, let's look at the detail about this part, residual output. So the first column is called observation. Actually, this is the order of your observations. So the first observation, second observation, third observation. So we totally have 7 observations. And the second column is a predicted GPA, y. So the second column is our predicted y value. And the third column is the residual, and last column is the standard residuals. So now it's pretty clear. In order to create the residual against the predicted y value, and we just use the second and the third column from our residual output. So what can we do for this case? So first, go to the insert and find the scatters. And go down, choose the first one, scatters, the basic scatter plot. So once you choose it, make sure it's a blank chart area. So if you can see some data showing inside of a chart, which means before you click the insert, your cell is already select certain number. So in order to avoid that, I highly recommend you, before you draw your scatter plot, choose one of the empty cell instead of choosing any number. So choosing any blank cell and go to insert and scatter plot. Now we can start to click design and select data. So once you select data, you should see this window called select data source, select data source, and click add. So you don't need to have the series name, but you need to have X value and Y value. So how can you decide X value and Y value? So actually, the X value here actually means what is your horizontal axis. And we know for our horizontal axis in this special scatter plot is our predicted Y value. Then you click this little icon and find your predicted Y value, choosing from the first number. Don't include the labels. Please remember, don't include the labels. Then click this little icon. Then we can choose the Y values. So the Y value, as we know, is the vertical axis value. So vertical axis value actually is our residuals. So click this little icon and choose the first number in the residual column. Don't include the labels. And drag down to the last residuals. And click this little icon again. And now you can click OK. And everything is fine. You should see only one series 1. And here is the number for our predicted Y value. And click OK. So now we have our scatter plot residual against the predicted Y value showing up here. The only thing you need to change is the chart title. Please let yourself know this is the residual against predicted Y value. So by looking at this plot, and what we can find is actually you can obviously see that when the Y value is when the predicted Y value is, as the Y value becomes larger and larger, your residuals value get the absolute value for the residual gets smaller and smaller. So that's why you can see this kind of special shape. It's like a loudspeaker shape, right? Like a triangle here. So in this case, we think the first assumption is violated because our distribution, the residual is not evenly distributed as our Y value changes.